Good evening. We already have a good number of people on board. This is one more of our lectures in the lecture series, the Portuguese and the Lusophone-World lecture series, sponsored by the New Bedford Whaling Museum in cooperation with the Brown University Department of Portuguese and Museum Studies and the American Foundation. Today, we're going to have a speaker that is from around here, even though he's talking from the countryside, north of Lisbon in Portugal, in a small town that he says it looks like the Azores, but the sea is a little bit further away. Miguel Moniz. Miguel Moniz is from Falmouth, from just around New Bedford. He has a PhD from Brown University, a PhD in anthropology. He has lived in Lisbon since 2005, but he is a descendant of an Azorean family, all from Falmouth. He's an anthropologist, as I said. He's now at the Center for Research in Anthropology, PRIA, ISCTE, Instituto Universitário de Lisboa in Portugal, and is director of the Migrant Communities Project, New England, Portugal. He was a visiting scholar at Brown from 2019 to 2021, where he was the Michael Teague Visiting Professor of Portuguese and Brazilian Studies. It was a program sponsored by FLAD in the fall of 2019. Miguel Moniz research examines migration, labor history, race, and ethnicity, and his work has been supported by fellowships and grants from Fulbright Foundation, European Research Council, Portuguese National Science Foundation, FCT, Fundação Luso-Americana, National Endowment for the Humanities, and Massachusetts Cultural Council. His recent publications have examined the Day of Portugal in New England and Portuguese labor activism and Portuguese and Cape Verdean voluntary associations in the early 20th century. He's currently working on a paper on Portuguese migration in agriculture in New England, and is finishing a book on English language sea chronicles about the Azores in the 16th century. Miguel Moniz has collaborated with the Whaling Museum in the past, including an academic conference on migration and mill work in New England. And he has taken part many times in the Moby Dick Marathon, where he has read in English, in Portuguese, and he has played the role of the Azorean sailor in Culture Spark Chapter 40 knee play. Let us welcome Miguel Moniz. Let us listen to him, because I promise he has a lot to tell us about the Portuguese and Cape Verdeans in Falmouth, Massachusetts. Miguel, welcome.
Thank you, Nassimo. I appreciate your invitation, and also would like to thank Gil Perry, who is in charge of this program, or is working with you on this program, as well as thank President and CEO of the New Bedford Whaling Museum, Amanda McMullen, for the invitation as well to have a great opportunity to come here and be able to speak with you. Onésimo was my professor at Brown, and many years ago, and my mentor for many years, a person that I really started learning about the Portuguese in significant ways with when I was a graduate student, and really haven't stopped learning from him about this, from his continued publications about this. Whenever I speak around Onésimo, I always feel like I'm studying or preparing to give a final exam, even though I've been at this for a while. But in any case, I hope to give you some information about Falmouth. Having grown up in Falmouth, been born and raised there, I have a lot to say about Falmouth. It's a place I really love. I guess the word I would use is proselytizing about the Portuguese and Cape Verdean communities there for a very long time. To that end, I'd also like to say hi to a couple people that I see here in the chat, including Larry Balbuena, who's the president of the Cape Verdean Club of Falmouth, who was actually one of the participants in the project, the Migrant Communities Project, which was took place over the past year in Falmouth, as well as Lou White is also here. Karen Hines, I think I can see. The Migrant Communities Project was a project that talked to people, or tried to enlist the work of people in town to talk about their own organizations, including the Cape Verdean Club, Portuguese American Association, and also worked to develop outreach and help get the Cape Cod, Cape Verdean Museum and Cultural Center off the ground, which I'm very proud to say was successfully done last year when it launched in June. A lot of this work is work that I've been doing for many, many years, but also was supported in large part by my time at Brown when I spent some significant amount of time in Falmouth working on this project and a number of other projects. With that introduction, I'd like to just jump in. I'm going to share my screen here with you all and pop this open. Oh, while I'm doing this, I should also say that I see my mother in here as well, which I also want to just give her a quick hello, calling in from Falmouth. Hi, Mom. And I'm glad to see that my niece, her granddaughters, I thought that she had a play tonight, and I was going to definitely not be a priority, but I guess something happened with the play, maybe got canceled because of the weather. In any case, can everyone see my screen? It should come up with a New Bedford Whaling Museum. I just want to make sure of that before I barrel ahead here. If I can get a nod from
you are
any
good,
of you.
Miguel. We see it.
Yeah, okay, great. So the talk that I'm going to give with you this evening, and I'm going to try and go fast here because there's a lot of stuff to get through. I promised a broad overview of Falmouth. That's going to really be impossible to do. I gave about a 6 or 7 hour program at the Falmouth Public Library over a number of weeks, and we really only got up to just after World War II. So I'm going to try and give you a quick little overview of Falmouth, just in case for people that don't have an idea about it. And then I will jump in really to the meat of the talk today, which something that Onésimo taught me and others of us is that you should always have some new information that people don't know about, as well as another important thing to do is try and present what's out there and maybe have a different take or different angle on it. So I'm going to try and give a little bit of an angle on what I think is the common wisdom or the received wisdom about Portuguese communities in New England, certainly, about the sort of the political apathy that they have, or that they're purported to have. This comes from a number of sources, and there's been studies on this as well. I'm going to try and challenge some of those things today. By the end of the talk, I hope that I will have been able to have maybe get you to rethink a little bit about how actually politically active some of the Portuguese were, at least what they were doing in Falmouth. And then hopefully, I think that if what we see in Falmouth is maybe not really that atypical, I think it's actually what's happening in a lot of other places. So the first thing I'd like to do is talk a little bit about how the Portuguese got to Falmouth. And one thing that I'll do here is Falmouth actually, I don't know if you know about it. And first I'm going to skip ahead to a slide here that I have later on. If you don't know where Falmouth is, let's see, this is Falmouth right here. You have this little chunk right here is where Falmouth is, New Bedford, Fall River. This is a rural agricultural part of Cape Cod. We call this Falmouth or the Upper Cape. It's a little confusing because this is called the Upper Cape, and this over here is the Lower Cape. When I was a kid, this was all called the Lower Cape. Now they call this the Outer Cape, which I guess they needed to differentiate themselves from other parts of the Upper Cape. As it existed when I was a kid, this was the Mid Cape, but it always was confusing to people who were from off Cape because this is higher than this part, yet this is called the Upper Cape, but it refers to when you enter the Cape. So for any of you who are not Cape Codders, that's our way of referring to it. But I'm mostly going to talk about Falmouth today. Falmouth actually may surprise people. It was actually quite a substantial whaling town. If I have this log here, you can see you have these are the number of ships and the number of voyages that those ships took over the course of a period of time. No surprises here. New Bedford, Nantucket, Provincetown, New London are leading the pack. But you also have a bunch of other places here that, and I tried to list some traditional places where older populations of Portuguese settled. And when I say Portuguese at this point, I want to be very clear. I'm talking about people who came from Portugal and Portuguese territories. So with the independence of Cabo Verde in the 1970s, we can talk more about national identities and these kinds of things. But if I refer, I try also not to reduce all of these people to their national identities, but rather refer to these places as places that they came from. So I'm not calling them Portuguese. I'm saying they came from Portugal. And when I do that, I'm up until the 70s. I'm including people from the Azores, from Madeira, from continental Portugal, from Cabo Verde, and from other places that that made part of this colonial geography of Portugal. But not surprising, these are all places where there's a lot of Portuguese. Falmouth comes into this, and this actually surprised me when I did this research, but it ranked in the top third of US whaling ports in terms of the number of ships and also the most number of voyages. It doesn't seem like a lot here, 13 ships, 51 whaling voyages, but that was enough to put it over the top. You know, for example, a lot of the other ones only had a few whaling voyages. Falmouth also, up until about the mid 1800s, was a place that made whaling ships. And this is the Uncas here, as you can see over here, which was actually a ship made in Woods Hole. Woods Hole, for those of you who may not know, is this part of Falmouth down here. It was the only port. There was a port actually that brought packet ships with agricultural products all over the place up to Boston. And this is, of course, before the canal got built and the ships had to come this way, but mostly they were going south at that point. One thing that's really important to talk about, though, as I move on here, why do migrants come to Portugal? We often think of, there's a romantic view of Portuguese coming to New England as all having come on whaleboats and being fishermen. And I always ask, I don't, it's going to be a little bit difficult to do online, but if you could think to yourself, what percentage of people that you think of immigrants from Portugal came during the time period of 1830 to 1870, or 1820 to 1870, and a time period from 1870 to 1920. So if we basically cut that 100 years in half, we ask ourselves what percentage came before or after. Put it in your head. I'm going to give you a second to think about that when I move on to the next slide, which is to say that I'm almost positive that the percentage that you have coming before 1870, that is during the whaling period, is going to be much larger than it actually was. In reality, it's only about 5 to 10% of the Portuguese that came over the time period came to the US as a result of, during this whaling period that came from Portugal. They were really coming as a result of industrial, to working in industrial factories and industrial manufacturing as a result of the Second Industrial Revolution. So if we look at the migration from Portugal to the US, it's around 5,000. And these numbers are very difficult to come by. I used a number of existing documents. It's hard because there's a lot of undocumented migration. Prior to 1870, they're not really looking at who comes in and cataloging them. But the fact is that most of the Portuguese that came to the US during this time period came as a result of being contracted or as a result of the proliferation of industrial mills in New England. Another thing I'd like to kind of point out is that we kind of have this image of what this migration meant. Where do people come from? Here they came from, from continental Portugal, from Cabo Verde, from Madeira, from the Azores. They made a direct beeline to New England, and that's where they stayed. This also is not accurate. Although, of course, many people did that. The picture gets a lot more interesting and complicated when we consider all of the migrant labor mobilities. And I just had fun throwing arrows everywhere. This isn't really, there's a lot of arrows missing in this. But you can sort of see there's people going back and forth from islands to islands. Tons of people are working on packet ships. They're returning home. They're coming back. They're finding other places to work. They're working. You have a migration that comes all the way to go work on plantations in Hawaii. There's Portuguese working on plantations, sugar plantations here in the Caribbean. I discovered a couple of populations, and some of the oldest Portuguese associations that existed in America were founded not in New England, not in California, but actually in New Orleans of all places, as a result of some communities in the 1840s that went there to work some Azorians that went there to work on sugar plantations. The same can be said of the migrations. I don't have any arrows on this because I wanted you to be able to see it, but the same can be said about migration around this region. So people didn't just come to New Bedford and stop. They came to New Bedford, they sought jobs in other places. And this is how most of the people in our story came to Falmouth. There were people that were predominantly working in factories or had come to the US to work in industrial manufacturing, got laid off, a huge percentage, something like 30% of the population, according to according to Philip Sylvia, were getting laid off every year in the mills for months at a time. Well, these people needed work, and they found places to do work. Yes, in the towns where the mills were, but they oftentimes would go to another town to find work if there was a possibility to do that. Many of them also came to the Cape, where there were opportunities to work on industrial farms. The one thing that's really important to point out is that although there weren't a lot of people that came from whaling, what those whaling communities did was establish links to the island, so that when more labor was needed, they were able to call them and send for them and contract other workers. So we have a lot of people coming to Falmouth as a result of this, these sort of secondary and third migrations. I came across people that had been in California. I came across people that had been in Brazil, went from the Azores to Brazil to New Bedford and then to Falmouth. These very circular and round trajectories. Also people leaving after they'd been in Falmouth for many years. So we have here another image of Falmouth, just to give you an idea. The main places that Portuguese really first started coming into were Woods Hole, because this is where a lot of the jobs were. But they quickly soon spread, and where they also had a lot of wealthy patrons working in domestic service here and down here in Woods Hole. But they also had a lot of patrons and worked in agriculture in places like T-Ticket and East Falmouth. These are places that were largely abandoned, that the Portuguese sort of settled into and started developing farms. But we're not quite there yet in our story. The story still we're still getting to those to that manufacturing. So, I mean, rather to that agricultural production. Quickly, I want to talk a little bit about the Lusophone community today. This is a great picture of some of the women that really run. Larry's in there now as president, but these are some of the women that run the Cape Verdean Club in Falmouth. Gilberta and Corey Green here, who really did a lot of work on, or Filomena Gilberta and Corey Green, who did a lot of work on some of the research of the project that we did. This is the Portuguese American Association here, an event. I think this is I took this from a Day of Portugal event this past year. And this is someone doing capoeira demonstration at the Cape Verdean Museum in Falmouth at the inauguration. But in any case, it's a really diverse and vibrant community in Falmouth that really started during this time period, the early, late 1800s. Actually, Lou White, who's also on and has done a lot of research, is doing a project right now on the first Portuguese who came to Cape Cod, and he's uncovered people from the 1850s in Falmouth and earlier. Really, this migration really kicks up and starts to pick up at the turn of the century. Interestingly, I have some slides later on that I'll show you. Actually, let me just dip over to those right now. But we can see, for example, on if we look over here at this slide, you'll see that while population starts to dip down with the decline of the mills, in Falmouth it keeps going strong. And that's as a result of people, looking for jobs in Falmouth as a result of losing opportunities elsewhere in the region. So Falmouth then gets a huge influx of new immigrants that come in after in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. First, as a result of the Capelinhos volcanic eruption and the Azores Refugee Relief Act, as well as the 1965 laws that overturned some of the restrictions, or that overturned the restrictions, most of the restrictions, some of them had already come off the books. On immigrants coming into the U.S. We also have in the 80s a volcanic eruption. Although the Azores government, the Portuguese government, tried to do, put resources into the Azores to keep people from leaving as they did in the 60s, there's still a number of people that came from Terceira Island to Falmouth. Although most of the early population comes from São Miguel and Pico, we have in this later period a lot of people coming from Serra. And then finally in the 90s, there's a large group of people coming in from Brazil as well, from various places in Brazil. So again, what kind of work were people doing? They were doing mill work. This is an image of Woods Hole. I'm going to now go back to the beginning of the century and sort of focus my talk now between the beginning of the century until about World War II. So interestingly, there were a lot of mills in Falmouth. And why was this? Well, for many years, about 200 years, there was a huge sheep industry in Falmouth. A lot of the wool that was used in factories, even in New Bedford, Fall River, actually came from Falmouth. If anybody's ever been to Falmouth, a place like Bourne Farm, this is a place that employed a lot of Portuguese at the farm. but they were a major sheep farmer, and you can see all these sheep walls all over the place in town. You know, when we were kids, we'd run around in these little walls. But and there were 3 woolen mills actually also in Falmouth. As it became a lot cheaper, and as all of the large industrial manufacturing centers moved to places like Lowell outside of Boston, Providence, Pawtucket, and New Bedford, Fall River, Falmouth just couldn't keep up and couldn't compete. They were too far away. They didn't have the access that all these places had to, you know, to ship their product out. So, and then there was a huge fire in one of the main mills in Falmouth as well, and that actually sort of ends the mill work. However, where one of the mills was, it ends up getting turned into by the family that owned the mill, the Swifts. The Swift family actually was very big in whaling, one of the main Falmouth whaling families. They then become a mill family. And then after that, they become 2 of the brothers in the family end up becoming among the largest cranberry bog owners on the Cape. When we talk about the Cape, a lot of times people really think about cranberries. That's the defining feature of Cape Cod is cranberries, cranberries, cranberries. And it's true that cranberries came to dominate vast swaths of Cape Cod, the Upper Cape. Marston's Mills had cranberry bogs, Falmouth did, Bourne did. And then off Cape, Wareham, obviously Mattapoisett, these places, Plymouth also had cranberry bogs. A place that nobody really knows about or talks about is Harwich. There's a huge Cape Verdean community in Harwich, which is, I guess, technically in the lower Cape, but a really interesting community there that's grossly understudied, and that nobody really talks about is the Cape Verdean, vast and large and vibrant Cape Verdean community in Harwich as well as the Cape Verdean community in Marston's Mills. So many of these workers, when they were laid off, they'd come down to Falmouth, they worked in cranberry bogs. This was very, very difficult work. You know, seasonal pickers come from the Azores and Cape Verde. You don't make a living working full-time doing cranberries. So a lot of the Portuguese that decided to settle there and didn't want to go back to the mills took advantage of the fact that there were very, very cheap farms in the eastern part of the town and started to settle there and buy up land. Again, really harsh conditions. This is an image. These images here are actually from Louis Hine photographs that he was trying to take. And you know, they look very pastoral and beautiful, and people look at these images and see cranberry bogs, and oh, isn't this lovely? These exotic people working in these cranberry bogs. But it's just, you know, these are child workers. These are people making no money. These are people working very, very long hours. And we'll find that the owners of the cranberry bogs, especially the Swifts, and Frederick K. Swift, one of the people that I'm going to talk about, was not a very nice guy and did not really treat these workers very well. These were the kinds of places that they lived. You know, there'd be 18 people, 20 people in these cranberry picker sheds or picker shacks, as they're called. And actually, Larry Balbuena, who's the new president at Cape Verdean Club, he actually showed me some pictures of doing some construction work, and I stupidly didn't get the picture to put it in the presentation. That was a fail. But he was doing some renovation work on what were these old sort of picker shacks. And, you know, you can see them around town. Sometimes the people would build into, you know, they would just sort of envelop the old picker sheds into their new homes, make a walkway to it and kind of create an extension. And most of them are tragically torn down. It's something that I think Falmouth Preservation should really do work with, is trying to identify these picker sheds where these workers worked, and really identify them and create some kind of historical landmark status for these incredible, you know, pieces of history that we have that sadly are getting, you know, that are getting taken away. In any case, the workers did not really cotton well to this work. It was difficult, hard, backbreaking work, and they were always working for other people. A couple of exceptions that I'll get to in a second. There was one Cape Verdean man, Luis Santos, who actually was a cranberry bog owner. And I'll talk about him in a second. But in any case, alternatives and supplements to seasonal bog work were strawberry farming. Now, there were a lot of other things that they did. The Portuguese were working as domestic servants. They were working as laborers, building roads and houses. A lot of them actually founded the Falmouth Fire Department, which ends up becoming, over the rest of the century, including my dad, who retired. I started off as a fireman and retired a captain in the Falmouth Fire Department. The Portuguese actually had a major role in founding the Falmouth Fire Department in the early part of the century. Some of the wealthier immigrants, as I say, they were able to start their own bogs. but most opened family farms. They started family farms. And this is where we start to get some divergences with the people that were working in the large mill cities. I think there were fewer opportunities for people in the large mill cities to do things like start their own farms. Although what they did, and I think that there are parallels here in the story that I'm telling, with what was going on at Dartmouth, what was going on in Little Compton, Rhode Island, and some of the other places where Portuguese actually did, and people from Portugal were actually working on bogs. I mean, we're actually working in agriculture and started to own their own farms and etc. So the key crops that they started were strawberries. And when we talk about the Cape, we should not be talking about the Cape and being associated with cranberries. That's sort of the story that gets told. Ocean Spray likes to tell that story also. But the reality was strawberry farming produced way more of a crop and brought way more money than cranberries actually did. These are some of the people that started this production. This is John Emerald up here, one of the very first. He came to Falmouth in about the 1870s, 1880s. Was the very first commercial strawberry grower. This is Alexander Barrows, a major landowner in town and also a substantial impresario. This is Luis Santos, also from Brava, Cabo Verde, who ended up becoming cranberry bog owner. He was a major strawberry farmer, officer in one of Falmouth's 3 strawberry cooperatives, Cartels. And Lou White also found out doing some research that he was also an officer in one of the many Espírito Santo, the Wacoit Espírito Santo Holy Ghost Society that exists and still exists today in Falmouth. José Moniz, I would be remiss to say, was also a major business person who started not 1 but 2 strawberry cooperative cartels in Falmouth. Was also my forebear in the story of Falmouth. He is a person that also would turn later to construction trades in the post-World War II era, as many Portuguese did, which is another part of the story. So the Portuguese didn't do it alone, and that's an important part of the story also, is that Falmouth had a very interesting makeup, the non-Portuguese makeup. It's really interesting to understand how quickly and rapidly the Portuguese came to dominate Falmouth. From in a period of around just 15 or 20 years, Portuguese go from 34 people to 2,000, which doesn't really seem like a lot if you're used to talking about the numbers of Portuguese and people from Portugal, Cabo Verde, Azores, Madeira in Fall River, New Bedford. But it was around the same percentage that they had in those places, the comparable percentages anyway, of people that were there. On top of it, places that we think of as having a lot of people from Portugal, like Lowell, Mass, in 1912, when it was, when a lot of the Lowell mills were really bombing, had actually about the same amount of raw numbers of people from Portugal as Falmouth did, even though the population was substantially smaller. So they have a major impact right off the bat. But they didn't do it alone. And there's a couple of key figures here that create partnerships. So one major business partnership was created with José Moniz and Wilfred Wheeler, who was, there are a number of scientific organizations in Falmouth, including the Marine Biological Laboratory. We all know today Falmouth is the home of Hui. But Hui didn't develop, by accident. The National Academy of Sciences had their summertime retreat there, where most of the top research scientists in America would go during the summertime. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, from field trips when I was a kid, that Abraham Lincoln might have started this. If someone knows better in the chat, please feel free to disabuse me of that. There were American presidents that would come down to summer in Falmouth as well, and the Marine Biological Laboratory was started there. So Wilfred Wheeler was actually the brother-in-law of the director of the Marine Biological Laboratory. And and he also was a guy that was involved in town politics as well. They partnered with the Portuguese to create this crop. They encouraged them to form these cartels so that they can get a much better price, from Boston growers. And so they do. They form. There's a couple of cartels that get formed in Falmouth. And the result is incredible. There's a 1 million quart crop in 1922. In 1930, there's a 2.5 million quart crop. This is extraordinary amount of agricultural production. Of the 429 farms in Falmouth, 355 were strawberries. It wasn't all Portuguese. There were a couple of non-Portuguese industrial farms that came up. Cunimessa Ranch was one. Also, the Crane Estates was another. It's a really important story to tell of the, there's also a number of sort of patronage relationships that take place with some of the wealthier non-Portuguese that the Portuguese are working with that help them quite a bit. This is one side of the picture. And in Marston's Mills also, there are also similar sort of positive relationships with individuals. Another thing to keep in mind, a lot of the people that were coming to work and harvest these crops were Portuguese working for other Portuguese. So oftentimes what would happen is, Cape Verdeans would come, they'd pick for a season and they'd want to start their own farms, and the people that were already there and established would help them to do that. Oftentimes, people who own land, older people from Portugal who owned land would sell it to these newcomers and help put them into business. So it was a very collaborative and cooperative community in some ways. Although what I'll get to in a moment is perhaps a little bit different. So these are some of the strawberry cartels that we have here. Again, most of them are smaller family-owned farms. It's also important to note, and I'm going to talk about these in a second, but a number of very important Portuguese civic associations are formed during this early period. Foremost are the Holy Ghost societies. There's several Holy Ghost societies. There's still 3 right now that exist in the area, 2 of which were in existence in the turn of the century. By the turn of the century, I mean the turn of the 20th century. So around 1900, they were formed before the 1900s. That's the Santuit Catuit Holy Ghost Society and the Wacoit Holy Ghost Society, which then changed its name to the Fresh Pond Holy Ghost Society, which both still exist. The Wacoit Fresh Pond Holy Ghost Society still has an annual feast that is anyway before COVID. Hopefully they're going to get a chance to go back to it. If not this year, then definitely next year. But these organizations actually were key places. All of the Portuguese had their meetings there. They had mass there. And in fact, a lot of the Holy Ghost societies all over the region would be the first stop for people to have mass. For people who wanted to have mass before this, they had to go all the way to Woods Hole. It was an all-day. You had to walk all the way down and then come all the way back to East Falmouth where people lived. This was untenable. So they first started having, and there was another Holy Ghost association at the time as well on Brickhill Road, which is now at the current site of the St. Anthony's Club, which is another Portuguese civic association that exists in Falmouth today. So these societies were instrumental in creating a sense of community for the people in town, giving them a place to meet, helping them to create a sense of cohesiveness in this new place that they had moved to. All of the economic cartels met at those Holy Ghost societies. That's where they had their meetings. Anytime there was a political meeting that we'll talk about next, that's where they had their meetings, was at these places. So as we can see, I also promised that when people think of Cape Cod's Portuguese, it's always about Provincetown. It's always about whaling. Well, here's an interesting little tidbit for you. Again, these are charts generated by Lou White as part of his research. You can see that Nantucket has this kind of peak in the 1920s and goes down after being, higher up earlier in the year. You also have this green line is Provincetown, which again peaks in the 1920s and then plummets really at the end of the whaling industry. Whereas Falmouth just keeps on growing. And it keeps on growing because all those places that are running out of jobs, running out of workers, they're coming to Falmouth to find jobs in these rural places and on these farms. So the population in Falmouth actually keeps growing. And where Falmouth still today has a contemporary population that's a very vibrant population of immigrants, Provincetown doesn't really have that, at least not to the extent that Falmouth does. So although Provincetown gets all the press, it's really Falmouth, and I know this is my homerism coming through, Falmouth pride, as we like to say in town. Falmouth is really the place where most of the Portuguese, Cape Verdeans, and also including a newer group of very vibrant community of Brazilian immigrants also in the town. So your move, Provincetown. To give some historical context to the next part of this talk, the final little part of the talk here that I have. I want to talk now about what kind of, we talked about some of the cooperative and collaborative moments that were collaborative endeavors that the Portuguese undertook with some of the non-Portuguese in town. I'd like to also talk here about a different kind of historical context in which migrant labor communities during the early 20th century were roundly discriminated against. This includes the Portuguese, Portuguese workers in the mills, and included also Portuguese workers working in Falmouth. So one thing that I'd like to talk about, some of you may or may not be familiar with some of the early sociologist and progressivist writing. Effectively, they were trying to look at arguments of what they called the immigrant question, which was, there was a huge, like Falmouth went from 34 to 2,000 in the total to make a total population of Falmouth of 5,000 people, 40% of a population all of a sudden. This was something that was happening in a lot of these industrial mill cities. And the immigrant question was really the framing of a fairly racist question, which was, what are we going to do with all these immigrants that are taking over our towns and our cities? And like, these are some of the writers. I believe this quote is from Bushy, but these are some of the writers that were looking at this immigrant question specifically related to the Portuguese. The way that they talked about the Portuguese, they, as beautiful as some of the early modernist writers like Mary Heaton Vorse talked about the Portuguese, these writers, these sociologist writers and social sciences writers that are doing these studies, we're talking about them in very different ways. First of all, most of the arguments at the time were that these new immigrants, because they were racially inferior, and these are their words, obviously not mine, they should not be able to become American citizens, and we need to stop them from coming into the country because they're going to dilute Americans and change the composition of Americans. If any of this sounds familiar, it certainly should, because we're 100 years later and there's still people talking in similar ways about immigrants, including, unfortunately, a lot of Portuguese. But this is the way that people were talking about Portuguese at the time. And this was also taking place in Falmouth as well. So there is some pushback in the community. One of these people is Frederick Swift, who was a major employer of Azorean Cape Verdean cranberry bog owners. Swift has a diary that he writes, and he talks about, he talks about his workers in really horrible terms. And he refers to them, the Portuguese and the Azorean and the Cape Verdeans that work for him, as darkies. It's important to remember that at this time, all of the people from Portugal are sort of looked at as one group. A lot of the political things that take place later on in the century hadn't yet happened, or the political discourse is separating different kinds of groups. One thing that emerges, however, during this time period are distinctions or categories of white versus Black Portuguese, but it doesn't really matter if one's a white Portuguese or Black Portuguese, even as these categories emerged. Actually, these were social sciences categories. They're all seen as non-white or as less white or as suspect white compared to other kinds of immigrants in the US. Frederick Swift also writes a number of really racist letters, in addition to a number of other people. This is a deep dive in this. We don't really have much time to get into this, but some of the stuff they were calling for the Portuguese to be put in segregated schools, as was being done in Harwich, by the way, with Cape Verdean students during this early 1900s time period. And these were some of the things that the less savory things that the Portuguese in town confronted. Well, another thing, there's a lot of police harassment. If you go through the Falmouth Enterprise Archive, which is a phenomenal archive to take a look at on the Falmouth Public Library's webpage, you see the Portuguese getting harassed for all kinds of stuff. This was a liquor raid that took place during Prohibition. And if you really look at what they confiscated, I mean, these were a bunch of Azorean and Cape Verdean guys who were making, their aguardents, and they were making their wine, to drink with their families. And these guys came, 1.5 quarts of moonshine, 1/2 jug of wine. I mean, come on, this is just abject harassment. This is what what they were doing here. And you see a bunch of these cropping up in the reports as it takes place. So one of the kind of the themes that runs through contemporary sociological studies and anthropological studies about the Portuguese and histories is that the Portuguese really only became politically active in the post-1960s generation. And that prior to that, they really were apathetic. They weren't involved in a lot. They weren't really politically engaged or politically involved. I believe that this is completely untrue. And I believe the historical record will point this out. Curiously, it's really interesting. A lot of people who I would never expect to talk about this way. There's an incredible book written by Gilberto Fernandes that everybody should read. It's one of the best history books right now written about the Portuguese, continental Portuguese and Azorian modern experience, although he does get into some Cape Verdean stuff, Cape Verdean migration and issues specific to Cabo Verde. It's really an incredible history that he writes, and he talks about a lot of political actions that the Portuguese take, but he doesn't really see it as politically. He still kind of mutes this earlier period as having any kind of political impact, or the Portuguese being heavily involved in politics. Which I don't know what to say. It's I believe that if you look at in the next 10 minutes, I hope to change your mind about that if you still think that. This is from Esther Lee Smith's classic, an important, characterization of, this isn't her, but she did a survey of different people, non-Portuguese, Portuguese people, the top older Portuguese generations, to talk about how they saw the Portuguese. Hopefully you've been reading along, and sort of the key word here is that they're disinterested in community affairs, incapable of organizing for effective political or economic change. So keep this in mind when we slip to the next slide, the next several slides. So, one thing that's really important there are a lot of different ways that we look at this. One is direct political activism versus electoral participation. And that's something that people say, well, maybe the Portuguese were involved in some forms of political activism, but they really weren't involved in electoral politics. Also, we're going to hopefully change that idea a little bit as well. One thing I want to say is that Falmouth community is somewhat a little bit different as we try and scale this out to other places. Because of the large percentage of people that owned land, were homeowners, had their own businesses, this might have changed their participation, and because of the large percentage that they had in the town as well, and that they had, that they were money players also in the town, made them perhaps be more politically active in Falmouth than they might be other ways. But I think that there are a lot of parallels that we talk about. In fact, some of the very same organizations that were involved in political engagement, including the Portuguese American Civic League, including the Portuguese Fraternity, were active in many, many other places throughout New England. It just is a matter of going into, my primary archive in this has been local newspapers in the town where the Portuguese were living. So, of course, the Portuguese, the main way the Portuguese were engaged was labor movement activism. And the Portuguese were engaged in the early period in Bedford strikes, Fall River strikes. You had a lot of people coming from Portugal, continental Portugal, with experience as syndicalists. They were deeply involved. The people from the Azores, the people from Cabo Verde, who were mostly farmers, were not really involved, or fishermen. They were not really involved in the beginning, but they became involved. And major labor leaders during the time period, like Eula Menz, in her oral history archive and at the Frederick Menz archives, talks at length about how, although maybe at the beginning, that these people, eventually people from Azores and Cabo Verde, became very, very important to the labor movement, and were certainly involved in it. Even in Falmouth, there was some labor movement activity. For example, in 1917, some Cabo Verdeans who were contracted to work in the mills refused to leave Long Wharf when they're told they're going to go to Cape Cod, because it was going to be, their wages were basically going to get cut and they were going to have to leave. There's also some labor activism in Falmouth. A bunch of Azorians went on strike at an ice house, were all summarily fired, unfortunately. But it's to say that there was actually some movement of this. Another form of political activism is protection of, the Portuguese were protecting their work. So this is a really interesting document that I came across in Falmouth Historical Archives. It's a petition by the Portuguese lobbying the municipal government to allow their children to miss school so that they could help bring in the strawberry harvest. The strawberry harvest takes place for a very short period of time. All of those quarts of strawberries that you saw earlier, those million quarts of strawberries, all get brought in a period of, maybe the bulk of them anyway, get brought in a period of about a month. And so all, child labor was a key element of this, and they wanted to have their kids be able to leave school. So they petitioned the school board to be able to do this. I cut this off, but there's probably about 40 or 50 names on this petition. It goes on to another page, I just couldn't show it all. So this is another way that they're politically active. They also fought back against some of the racist writing against the Portuguese in the newspapers. This is John Emerald, who there was a picture of in the beginning, the first commercial strawberry grower. This was written by an anonymous Portuguese person. This is a letter over here by another person who would become a key figure, Thomas Ferreira, who ends up being one of the key players in the Portuguese fraternity that I'll talk about in a second. And then so they do an incredible letter writing campaign against some of these, and so they were engaging in the newspapers. They were not silent. They were not complacent. You also have all of these associations that were doing political activities. A strawberry cartel is effectively an economic activity. They're taking control over a vast swath of the economy. They're making it about Portuguese having a place, a political voice, not only a political voice, but an economic voice in the town, as were a number of these other organizations. And you can see the vast number of associations that existed in Falmouth, and many of these still exist today. So another, and this is another, again, our economic farmers cooperative. So that's one. I want to quickly dip into this because another major way that Portuguese, not only in Falmouth, but all over the region, participated in political movements was by participating in the movement to Americanize the immigrant. This was a progressivist movement that took place in the early part of the 1900s. The Portuguese actually, in Portuguese communities and Cape Verdean communities, carry this out throughout much of the century. And a lot of the rhetoric that we have today about Portuguese communities, I believe, comes from the movement to Americanize the immigrant. It was basically an idea that was started by progressive thinkers and politicians working with state governments, municipal governments, to get immigrant associations involved in teaching and educational civics training and all these kinds of things. The idea was that the reason that immigrants were not suitable for American citizenship was not that they were racially inferior, but that they were not educated in the correct way. Of course, in my reading of it, this is really just a way to get the many immigrants who are able to do so participate in white nationalist politics, because all the definitions of the institutions that we repeated that they would be participating in, were really about trying to get them to leave behind these sort of immigrant identities, their language, and join what were effectively white nationalist power politics. The associations joined these, especially the beneficial and societies and political organizations. The Portuguese fraternity has, they throw in, and there's 30 something of these lodges all over New England and in other places. They're a beneficent society. There are a number of Portuguese American Civic League organizations as well. And they throw in, they sponsor all kinds of nights in the, they have a night school and an Americanization movement. Is one of the things that they do. They also sponsor candidates nights. Portuguese fraternity has 300 participants. They sponsor events for governors, gubernatorial elections. They have former senators coming in to speak at their political nights. So, this is a very clear example of electioneering, of participation in the political process, as can really be named. During the more heated activism during the Depression, the Portuguese in one part of the town actually get together and make a large push for support for workers' rights and for workers to be given money. And this is happening mostly with a push in from the Portuguese parts of town. There are some heated meetings held, by the way, at one of the Holy Ghost associations with town officials, and it gets quite heated. The fight breaks out, and in fact, the town ends up sort of trying to push the Portuguese a little bit out of the process, but the Portuguese fight back as in this process. One of the most important and interesting organizations in Falmouth that I want to talk about is the Cape Verdean Citizens Political Club, which eventually morphs into the current day Cape Verdean Club of Falmouth. There were a number of electoral activities being undertaken by the Portuguese fraternity. However, who really picks up the ball with this and rolls with it even until the 1960s, and happy to say even more recently, is the Cape Verdean Citizens Political Club. This is a group of Cape Verdeans that originally start out, have meetings at a barber shop until their meetings get so big they end up taking over the school board. They have lists of members. They start running candidates in Falmouth, including candidates for public office. that come out of the Portuguese communities. This includes, and this starts to have results between the Portuguese Fraternity, Cape Verdean Citizens Club, running these candidates nights. And again, they would have senators there. They would have officials coming in for statewide office as well as local office. They start to get some, so the Cape Verdean Club actually supports John de Mello for his bid for school committee and for planning board in 1935. And lo and behold, he ends up getting elected to the planning board. You also have in 1932, John Augusta, who is a major figure. He actually starts a lumber yard. The Portuguese, when they make their shift to construction, you have to understand, most of the Portuguese were working not only doing strawberries or agriculture, but they were also working the building trades. They were building roads. So when the Portuguese wanted to work and start their own construction companies, there was a construction firm in town that did not refuse to sell materials to the Portuguese because they wanted to keep them working for their construction companies. So John Augusta ends up starting his own lumber yard, which specifically is designed to sell lumber and supplies to the Portuguese community. He, in 1932, so much for the Portuguese not getting involved in electoral politics, becomes a member of the finance board. You also have the entire Portuguese precinct, where most of the Portuguese are, which is precinct 4. This is in East Falmouth, elects an entire slate, almost entirely, of people from Cabo Verde and the Azores. So this is Cabo Verde. Anton de Mello, actually also a relative of mine, a forebearer of mine, and a number of other people here. So, as you can see, there is a tremendous amount of political participation in town, despite some of the ideas of that this time period was something that was not necessarily a time when Portuguese were particularly politically engaged. And as we can see, they were politically engaged in labor movement work. They were politically engaged in direct and indirect kinds of politicking that included getting candidates elected, trying to work for candidates, and these kinds of things. And lo and behold, they were also involved in running for office themselves. And actually, these organizations, and because they created this block of interested political operators, they were able to get candidates elected to office. Perhaps a potential lesson for more recent times. Falmouth also starts to develop a much larger regional reputation among Portuguese, having a prominent, it's having a very prominent Portuguese community. It gets reported all the time in Fall River, New Bedford, the goings on in Falmouth, in a lot of the Fall River and New Bedford immigrant newspapers. In fact, one of the really interesting, the Portuguese Fraternity in 1924 has its massive annual conference with hundreds of people that all come to Falmouth for the event. And the Enterprise, the Falmouth local newspaper, runs an entire column about it written in Portuguese, which they then translate into other languages. But it was written in Portuguese and published in Portuguese in the Falmouth newspaper. Very, very interesting. So I'm going to stop there, open the floor to questions to you all. I hope this has been interesting, informative. There's a lot to get into here, but I really wanted to try and to pack in a lot for you, and also talk about some of the really interesting and fascinating organizations in Falmouth that have contributed to making this place a really very interesting place for Portuguese communities, and also a place that I think that has a lot of lessons. I don't know about lessons, but I think that we can look at some of the things that were taking place in Falmouth and try to look for similar kinds of things that were happening elsewhere throughout New England. With that, I'll stop and turn the floor over to Gil Perry and try and answer your questions if you even have any questions.
Well, that was great, Miguel. Anybody with questions can put them in the chat, and I'll get them over to Miguel. Carmen Santos, will you share slide presentations? My family came to Falmouth in the 1920s, and this is really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is all going up online, so this is getting recorded, so it's all going up online.
Good.
Do you still have family there?
Carmen Santos.
Yeah, Carmen, do you still have? I don't know if you still have family there.
Well, yes, she says I still have family.
Okay, great.
And then go ahead.
Yeah, Go ahead, Gil. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
A question from Joanne Treisman. What is the reason for the separate Cape Verdean and Portuguese American clubs?
Yeah, so this is a great question. On the first hand, I would say that the newer clubs were formed. Actually, there's one that came up in the 1980s. But one thing that I talk about in the longer version of this that we went into great depth in the program that we had at the Falmouth Public Library was a lot of the inter-community infighting that took place and the kind of racialized discrimination that was taking place among Portuguese as well. It's a really interesting question to hear people in town talk about it, including Cape Verdeans. The kinds of problems, a lot of the racialized discrimination problems really is a function of post-World War II. But I still think there's something there in this earlier period. I mean, as you point out rightly and importantly, there are separate clubs there. There's a Cape Verdean club and a Portuguese American club. What's interesting is that there was a lot of cooperation and collaboration between these clubs. There were a lot of Cape Verdeans that belonged to those clubs. And in fact, there were a number of Azorians that belonged to the Cape Verdean club, including an officer, a woman who was married to, an Azorian woman who was married to a Cape Verdean man. As well as one of the earlier clubs was the St. Anthony's Club, that while the Cape Verdean Club was building their building, they also helped them to have fundraisers and have events at the St. Anthony's Club. But but again, there are racialized politics that are taking place in the town. That's certainly important to point out. I think that a lot of it was also geographic in that a lot of the Cape Verdeans that settled into Falmouth settled around the T-Ticket area, especially around Sandwich Road, which is quite close to where I grew up, where my house is that I grew up in. And the clubs that they had a number of other clubs that weren't just, they had social clubs there, also the Cape Verdean community. But I think it's, clearly reading through it, it was a need to have themselves represented in a very important moment for Cape Verdeans to actually have a political voice. And I don't know how common that was in the region to have a specifically Cape Verdean political club that actually was a voice for specifically people from Cabo Verde. So, this is actually quite interesting. Yep.
I have another question from Gloria de Sa, but before I get to that, to just finish on this point, there are multiple Azorian clubs and I gather multiple Cape Verdean clubs. Was there any connection, and you said some, there was rivalry among them. Was there any connection to the specific islands they may have come from? For example, would there have been a club that may have been largely populated by people from Pico and another one from Fayal? Did that lead to any conflict?
Yeah, I think that the conflict, given that most of the people had come from San Miguel or some of the old timers came from Fayal, Pico, as Lou White's research has pointed out. But I think that the issues in Falmouth were more class-based than they were island-based. So, and that includes Cape Verdeans who were landowners as well. One of the institutions I didn't really talk about was St. Anthony's Church. It's an important institution that has some really fascinating history. We'll save it for next year. The issues I think are more class-based. There were people who were landowners, and there were people who were, and there were people who were working for those people. And a lot of the people talk about other parts of town where people were poor, had late night parties. And so I think a lot of the issues were class-based, in addition to being at some points, racialized as a result of the.
That leads into Gloria's question again from Gloria de Sa. Very interesting, especially in breaking some of the stereotypes about the Portuguese as being politically inactive. And I think you were just basically doing answering her question. Could you talk about how the high political activity of the Portuguese in Falmouth, as opposed to other places, might be related to land and business ownership?
Oh, Gloria, right on. Hi, Gloria. Thanks for your question. Also, Gloria, one of my favorite academics writing about Portuguese in New England, and a really important person as the emeritus, I guess, director of the Portuguese American Archives. But yeah, Gloria, I mean, you hit it on the head, right? It's about land ownership and business ownership. Like that provided pathways for a lot of these individuals to have connections with other business owners in town, right? It provided them with capital. It gave them some skin in the political game also. Like if somebody was a major business owner, they could talk to someone who was a political operative and, potentially have, some, some influence. But I don't want to like downsell the fact though that in places where that wasn't the case, there was a lot of unionization work, and I don't understand why union work was not seen as being politically active, or Portuguese participation in strikes was somehow seen as not necessarily being politically active, which it was, and those were people who were not owning businesses. But yeah, I think that's something that. That's true in Falmouth, but it's not true in all cases, right? I mean, like some of these were really small farms. The only reason that they had any kind of sway was because they all banded together and formed these cartels. Like individually, they were not doing well, and not all of them joined, by the way. Only about 60% or so of the Portuguese and Cape Verdeans joined these these agricultural cooperatives, much to the consternation of Bert Tomlinson, also a fascinating figure. He was the Barnstable County agricultural agent who really worked with these communities to try to get them to, he brought people down from Mass Agricultural College to show them sort of new scientific advancements in growing techniques. He was very, very sensitive to the fact that a lot of them didn't speak English. And so he would bring in people who could actually speak Portuguese and teach them about some of these things, or run his meetings in Portuguese. A really fascinating historical figure.
I have a comment from Carmen Santos, then a question. The first comment regarding St. Anthony's Church. She says St. Anthony's Church is where the various Portuguese communities came together. There were a number of festivals shared between the groups.
That's right, Carmen. That's absolutely right. I mean, like I said, I didn't really talk a lot about St. Anthony's, but St. Anthony's is a place where you had where a lot of these poles all came together. They call St. Anthony's Church, quote unquote, the church that Strawberries built. If you ever go to Falmouth, and maybe the Whaling Museum will sponsor a field trip to Falmouth, I'd be happy to take you all there on a guided tour.
And a question from Donald Ray.
All these organizations, and we can see some of these places. Yep.
Once again, from Donald Ray, did most identify as Portuguese or a specific region or island?
Yeah, I mean, I think that most actually identified as Portuguese, and this is a consciousness that even with the Cape Verdean club and a lot of the Cape Verdean community in Falmouth did both. Actually, they really identified as both Portuguese and Cape Verdean. I think that the Azorians to some extent did that, but this is an interesting time also. If you come from a country in Africa up until the 1950s, you are not going to be able to ever become a U.S. citizen. Like this law doesn't get changed until the 50s, right? To the 52 Immigrants Act. And for people who were coming from a place like Cabo Verde, who people might have considered to be a part of Africa, again, this is in the early part of this time period. It was very important for them, despite the colonial relationship. There was an instrumental interest to say that you were from Portugal. Of course, as the colonial moment and Salazar regime and a greater sense of independence. I mean, one of the big important things actually, and done by the Cape Verdean Club was they had a huge fundraiser for some of the droughts that were taking place in Cabo Verde. So this was something that was also very, very important. But yeah, I mean, it was complicated, but I think that people definitely did feel that they were part of a particular place. In certain spaces, I'm sure they felt that way more. And yes, Donald, I'm going to read these. Gil, I'm going to read these really quickly. Yeah. That was just to try and get through these. I don't know how much time we have. So
well, we're almost done. I have a comment from Anessimo has a comment. When are you going to publish this information in a book? And then, a final question from Carl Cruz. What role did the women play?
Yes, great question, Carl, and I have a number of things to say about that. So to quickly answer Onesimus' question, again, to my comments in the beginning, making me feel badly about not having published the stuff yet, but yeah, Onesimo, I would love to get it done as soon as possible. I'm trying to wrap up the book about the seafarers in the Azores, which is almost done, and I'd like to turn actually my attention to. I have several chapters of this pretty much already written and ready to go. It's just a matter of I would love to do that. That's my project in the next year, is to try and write and publish this in a book. To answer your question. So what role did women play? Women had a really interesting role. So first of all, it's really interesting to note that a lot of the Holy Ghost societies that all over the place were male-dominated societies. Women were not allowed to have officer positions. However, the women had to do all the work. So there was no Holy Ghost feast without women working in kitchens and doing all kinds of organizational and other leadership activities. Yet, they weren't allowed to become officers. Interestingly, in Stonington, for example, the women went on strike and they basically said, we are not going to participate in this at all unless you allow us to become officers. And similar things happened in Falmouth. So at the forefront of allowing women to participate was the Cape Verdean Club. And if you look at the Cape Verdean Club of Falmouth, the very first charter that they had in the 1940s, when they officially they changed from the Cape Verdean Citizens Political Club to the Cape Verdean Club, there is a woman who's on the original charter, and women become officers throughout that time. And even today, women are very important and prominent members of that of that organization, to keep that organization afloat. One of the organizations that didn't allow women in was the St. Anthony's Club. And they had a lot of problems. They have effectively largely gone extinct, although they did allow women in a number of years ago. A number of members that talk about that club, which was a very, very active club up until maybe the 90s, said that it wasn't really until they allowed, there was a women's auxiliary, but it wasn't until they allowed women in the general club that it became, that they kind of came back a little bit. The Portuguese American Civic League also had a women's auxiliary. And also the Holy Ghost Society of Wacoit and Fresh Pond also had a women's auxiliary who ran their own feast in town. So yes, women played a large role in these organizations. They played a large role actually in some of the political activities that took place, especially in the Portuguese American Civic League, less so in the Portuguese Fraternity, which was an order organization in any event. I hope that answers some of the question, Carl Cruz's question.
I think with that, we can wrap it up. That was great, Miguel. I think everyone would have enjoyed it. And I think there's one last question that may have come in here. Hold on. Simply a comment from Jean Montero. Thanks for a very thoughtful, very thought-provoking presentation. Lots to reflect upon. And I think that's a good comment with which to close.
Great. Thank you so much. I just want to thank you all again at New Bedford Whaling Museum for this invite, to Gil and Nesimu again, and to all the staff that worked hard to put this program together. I'm really looking forward myself to the upcoming speakers. I know there's going to be some great speakers in the series coming up. Whenever I don't know if you're ready to announce some of those people yet, but whenever you are, it'll be really worth tuning into. So thank you all. Thank you also for your time tonight. And for your patience with this. I'm available if anybody wants to reach out to me and talk to me about the stuff or get more information. I'd love to hear from you. And I'd also love to include you if you're interested in participating in the Migrant Communities Project, which is what's called a citizen science project. I'd love to enlist your help. We're trying to find people who are interested in conducting oral histories, who are trying to do research on their own families, and also research in some of these communities that we're looking at. I really look forward to hearing from you all, and thank you so much again for your time. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Good night.